Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to again be the host of a KCOR presentation. This presentation, the speaker, David Lapen, actually was an unknown person to me until I accidentally bumped into him at a community session in CARP. And I overheard him say something about, I'm a research scientist at Ag Canada. My ears pricked up because of my interest in food production and farming and the impacts that environmental change is likely to have on the food system. And so I reached out to him, and as I was doing some initial research, I saw that he's labeled as a research scientist at Agriculture and Agri-Foods Canada, and he does extensive research and publications on agroecosystems, health, and sustainability. Just my cup of tea, as it were. And then I started to look at, well, what is the extent of his research? And oh my God, the listing of that's on his Ag Canada page, in which he's referenced as the research scientist, it just goes on and on and on. And I think that this presentation is going to be a reflection of his involvement and the extensive staff that he has working for him. So David, I'm really looking forward to your presentation, and it's now over to you.
Thank you. Going down here, see if we can. Oops. There we go. Okay. All right. Everybody can see the title slide here. Reducing the environmental footprint of agriculture through nature-based activities and beneficial management practices. And I put a little caveat on there that it's a dim sum of some of our research activities that I felt may be relevant or of interest to the group here. And it's by no means everything we've done, but I think it's some topical components in there that I hope you can take away with you today. Some help for your activities and outreach. Just briefly wanted to define kind of a core element of what we do, and certainly what we're doing more and more now in our research. It revolves around ecosystem services, and really ecosystem services are the benefits that people obtain from the structure and function and capabilities of ecosystems. And to give an example here, we see a natural ecosystem, a forested landscape, where you have a lot of regulating and provisioning services outside of crop productivity, of course. And then you go to the crop side, and intensive cropland, of course, the services are very much dominated for crop productivity. But there's a happy medium where nature and agricultural activities can coexist to optimize all the relevant and important ecosystem services that we value and so on. And that's what we try to do, is to try to meld together agricultural activities and nature effectively. And so I'm sure we've all seen this in the landscapes around Ottawa, where there's intensive land clearing of linear features such as tree lines, hedgerows, fence lines, etc. And these natural features, which we know offer a lot of advantages to agriculture and mankind generally, are being lost at significant rates in Canada. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the implications of that through our research. And again, just to reiterate, the global aim of this research, and it is interdepartmental, it involves academia, it involves NGOs, industry. It's a mission to characterize and ultimately value emerging, new, and existing benefits, and understanding the trade-offs of natural features and agroecosystems, specifically under changing environmental conditions. And what we want to look at and what we're focusing on in our efforts are emphasizing co-benefits. So not just looking at how do we deal with carbon specifically, how do we deal with biodiversity specifically, but how do we deal with all these things together? And that makes things more complicated, but at the same time, it makes the pitch for having these in our landscapes more robust in a way. So this is an example of how we're approaching things. How collective research could help incentivize producers and watershed stewards to kind of retain or maintain or rigorously manage natural capital, natural features, and agricultural landscapes. And so we want to look at, as you see here, there's a variety of layers from, we have linear natural features here, such as healthy riparian zones and wetlands and tree lines. And then sometimes this happens where we cut everything down or dredge everything up, and we lose a lot of the vegetation and the biological functionality of these systems. So we want to look at things related to these contrasting bookends related to greenhouse gas emissions, carbon sequestration, biodiversity, habitat for pollinators and biocontrol agents, and also disease regulation, flood regulation, wind regulation, this kind of thing. And then provide some value to these things for stakeholders. Just an example of what we're seeing here, and this is these are graphs showing the percent of forest cover fraction in a watershed east of Ontario or Ottawa here, and we see that when we lose these features, we tend to see phosphorus and nitrogen loadings increase, and so we're seeing water quality impairment as a result of losing these features, partly as a result of increased land area for agriculture, but also reducing the buffering capacity these natural features have to reduce nutrient losses from the fields in the area. This is also showing how depression, wetland storage, increased soil permeability or health, and increased perennial vegetation at surface roughness can reduce floods, flood peaks in prairie landscapes. Again, these are trying to identify through modeling techniques how we can actually control and use natural soil health and natural landscape features to do that. And these graphs show, as you can see, depression storage. When we increase it, we reduce the flood peaks. Same thing for increasing the permeability or soil health of the agricultural soils, and also imparting surface roughness. And so together we can see that we can reduce significantly. It doesn't look like a lot, but those peaks are pretty significant reductions when we retain these features in the agricultural landscapes. So again, try and provide some value. And of course, in the prairies, we know very well that flood damages can be millions and millions and millions of dollars a year, and as well as drought implications. That is important then, that these features be retained somewhere in these landscapes. And in this flavor, what we're trying to identify, again, getting towards co-benefits or optimizing natural features in landscapes, agricultural landscapes. Do we prefer to have a full tree, woody vegetation coverage, something patchy, something more blocky, or something where there's zero in the terms of say, floristic biodiversity, where there's only maintained grassy boundaries, for example, or no boundaries at all. And really what we see are quite stark differences between these various kind of approaches to what we might want to look at in terms of, say, optimizing a lot of these ecosystem services that I've discussed already. So this is a kind of a complex slide showing some of the things we're looking at. And we're looking at things like bat and avian habitats impacted by management practices such as dredging and land clearing along ditches. The occurrences and diversity of vector-borne diseases and mosquitoes and vectors that carry the diseases in these landscapes. How do they respond to natural features, um, features that are devoid of natural landscape elements. And also how we can see, in this case here, amphibians respond to, say, vegetation clearing. And sometimes, as in this case, we see some positive implications as a result of say, clearing a landscape of trees, for example. You get more insulation and a warmer environment, and sometimes that could have a positive implication on some biodiversity endpoints. And also, we are trying to understand what kind of features in landscapes can provide the best bang for buck, if you so to speak, with regard to, say, avian species, particular woodland specialists or grassland specialists. And we see here that we have, with increasing proportions of these various land uses, there's responses from a species richness perspective. And so this is, again, evidence to help us understand how we can approach building robust and resilient landscapes for biodiversity and agricultural at the same time. This is a little bit more detail on understanding, say, how natural landscape features can actually regulate and modify mosquitoes that are usually associated with vector-borne diseases like West Nile virus, for example, or Equine encephalitis. And this is showing that residential gardens can have a larger proportion of these particular mosquitoes relative to forested areas. There's a lot of other kind of ecological elements that result from that, but that's important in understanding how we might use or value natural capital for purposes of regulating diseases. Furthermore, we look at greenhouse gas emissions, meeting carbon neutral targets, understanding the role of agriculture and the surrounding environment in emissions, carbon sequestration. Again, getting back to that, what kind of landscape features might we optimize to reduce both greenhouse gases, vector-borne diseases, increasing biodiversity, et cetera, concurrently. And we see in some cases where we might expect, well, we have a very healthy, mature landscape where it's a treed stream area. This particular area actually had the greatest N2O fluxes of all these landscape features shown here, partly due to less macrophytes in the stream and vegetation to uptake some of the nutrients that are lost from agriculture. So this gives you some idea that some of these expectations are maybe counterintuitive from an important greenhouse gas like nitrous oxide. And we also try to value riparian areas, even thin ones, protected areas that you see on the left there, a buffer from cattle grazing and watering. So we provide off-stream watering for these cattle, and that protects the local stream area. And when we do not protect in that way, we can have a kind of a degraded area around the stream, and also fecal pollution that can occur, and pathogens resulting from that fecal pollution, which can be public health risks or animal health risks, depending on what you're interested in. And what we try to do is develop quantitative microbial risk assessment tools. Those are kind of quantitative tools to understand pathogen exposure risks quantitatively associated with these particular features. So this is an example. You don't have to worry about understanding all that's over here, which are pathogens and microbial source tracker markers. But what we want to emphasize in this context of protecting these particular areas for purposes of public health is we see a particular stream system here. It's moving down this way, the flow, and we have, sorry about that. We have cattle that are grazing outside the riparian zone, and then downstream of that, we have cattle that are actually grazing alongside the stream. And we see at the start here, we have a lot of ruminant Microbial source tracking markers, those are biological markers indicating that we're seeing pollution from ruminants. That could be from manure applied to land, etc. And as we move beyond here towards the end of the riparian zone, we see more wildlife markers, which is consistent with wildlife proliferating in the riparian area. We also see some elevated human markers because there's homes along there. There was some septic leakages, etc. That can happen. And as we move down finally to the end of the study area, we see again with the input of cows along those streams, the ruminant marker increases again. And sometimes that reflects pathogens like Cryptosporidium or O157 coli, Campylobacter, etc. So this is these are studies to kind of help us understand the implication of cattle protecting these systems from grazing animals. And another project that's relatively new, but isn't relatively new from the Agriculture Canada perspective. This is courtesy of Dr. Wen Chen from the center I work at. I'm working with her on this, and we are examining how natural features in agricultural landscapes regulate the transport or deposition of fungal pathogens to crops. And you could see, as an example from some of her work there in the upper left, here we see an area where there was a source of an outbreak of sorts from rust of fungus, and how it moved through the air streams to places in Canada. And what we want to do is understand more of the kind of boundary layer implications of natural capital on regulating deposition of these things in our landscapes. So this is just giving you some example of some of the work we're doing and carrying out in that context. So it's a kind of a biovigilance approach to crop protection. There's another initiative that's called Canada One Water. It's globally led by NRCan, the Geological Survey of Canada, and Aquanti Incorporated, a hydrological consulting firm in Waterloo. And I'm the Agriculture Canada lead on this. And it's a model, a Canada-wide model that looks at the hydrological cycle holistically. And it's being developed for the entirety of Canada. And with that, what we want to do is understand how hydroclimate properties vary with climate change and land use change over time, and how the sector, in particular agriculture in our case, might be affected by those anticipated changes, and how could we maybe offset some of those impacts or amplify some of those impacts for increasing productivity. So this particular project is enormous, and I think will provide some useful data and predictive analytics for the government of Canada writ large, because it'll have implications for kind of fire risk areas, carbon sequestration, etc. So just to give you some example of and what we've tried to do, and this is work that is ongoing, valuing water, including groundwater, the whole hydrological cycle, in the context of ecosystem services. And there's using benefit transfer approaches, we can kind of estimate how many millions of dollars might water in a particular watershed just east of Ottawa here, the South Nation watershed. Well, how could we value that in terms of human use, environmental use, etc., the whole thing? And we see that it's enormous. And so a big portion of this, of the water budget in this context, is groundwater. So groundwater refines, sustains biomass during droughts. And you can see in this example that some of the highest value for water is found during droughty times. and that's important. And so it really emphasizes and underscores the importance we have to put into groundwater in particular in our sector. And in some countries, groundwater is the primary source for agricultural productivity. And we're blessed in Canada with lots of surface water, but you know, during droughts and so on, we might be singing a different song there. And that's what we're seeing here, is that, you know, we're seeing considerable droughts in some places in Canada. Obviously, agriculture in Alberta is multi-billion-dollar in GDP. In 2021, we're seeing droughty conditions there. How can we start offsetting that? Do we stop agriculture there completely, or do we kind of optimize the use of groundwater and other kinds of water resources? As an example, to the right here, developing networks that are kind of how do we use water from reservoirs, groundwater, surface water most efficiently and optimally to meet the needs of farmers, municipalities, and other energy sector stakeholders. And so it's just providing through the initiative capacity to do this over the entirety of Canada. And there's other derivatives resulting from these hydrological models, hydroclimate models, developing real-time forecast tools. And while we're always looking at the weather, and we're saying, hey, you know, is it going to be raining tomorrow, or is it, you know, next week, etc. From a farmer's perspective, they really want to know is, you know, what's the condition on my field going to be like? Is it going to be super wet? Is it going to be dry? Despite some of those forecasts, so we can forecast in real-time forecast mode. So things like groundwater levels, surface water flow, and in some cases, for watersheds that have a rich set of historical data, some water quality endpoints like nutrients or fecal indicator bacteria. And as you see in the slide, these particular attributes are important for flood risk, water impoundment strategies, and management. And the South Nation Conservation uses this approach. In fact, this is from, I believe this was taken from, oh, no, but it isn't. But it's a watershed, yes, there is. The bottom is from the South Nation results there. And again, to increase our capacity, soil moisture is critically important to the sector. It'll help us forecast disease risks, stem rot, for example. And if we could say something about forecasting soil moisture or critically problematic soil moistures at any point in time, it'll give farmers some heads up whether they need to apply fungicides to deal with the issue or not. So they're not maybe putting on particular pesticides spuriously or in an erroneous way. So it's going to help us kind of focus in on how to precision apply pesticides if necessary, as well as understand flood risk and carbon sequestration, etc. Water content in the soil is extremely important for those things. And I recently just provided in the couple slides ago how we might be able to predict endpoints, analytes of concern, nutrients, pathogens in a real-time forecast mode. And using machine learning and artificial intelligence approaches, we can come up with pretty accurate estimates of these particular target analytes and pathogens from the watershed that I referred to earlier, the South Nation watershed. That's pretty good. So, you know, we could maybe come up with a week forecast of say, E. coli blooming or whatnot. That's better than, you know, being able to go out and measuring the water right away and saying, oh, we have an E. coli problem or a potential pathogen problem, you know, close the beaches. We might be able to forecast now in a more meaningful way some of these problematic pollutants. And moving towards, again, water quality is affected by many things. And the big job we have is what is the role of agriculture, especially in complex ecosystems and watersheds where there's multiple uses. So manure and biosolids, whether liquid or solid form, are often applied to land for fertilizer. And there are many key water flow pathways that can result in excessive pollution of downstream receptors that are ecological sensitivities. The Gulf of Mexico hypoxia is a grand example for nitrate being a problem, and that's largely the U.S. has conducted quite a few mitigating operations to deal with that. But this particular flow pathway, preferential flow into tile drains, artificial subsurface drains that are lined under our fields, typically in this part of the world, to augment productivity. This is a very important route. Once pollutants get into these tile drains, they can kind of move, as you see after a manure application here, very quickly to the broader surface and water environment. So we want to see how we can manage this at the time of application and beyond. So I'm going to focus a bit on this particular flow pathway or pollution pathway in the following slides. And we know that in many cases, the worm on the left was not hurt in the experiment, the blue dye experiment, but cracks and worm burrows can be very, very important pathways by which pollutants from the surface, pesticides, manure, whatever, get into the tile drains and groundwater. And so these pathways can be managed at the surface a bit, but they're still going to exert some influence if things move deeper than that management zone, that tillage zone. And in that case, we try to manage flow. And so we've been looking at over the years what we call controlled tile drainage, managing physically the flow of drainage out of these fields with these controlled boxes during the growing season. And in so doing, what that does, it allows the farmers to retain water and nutrients in the field as groundwater for their crop growth. And it's the flexibility of it allows for draining the fields only when you need to. And those times in this part of the world are typically spring and fall. So during the growing season, we want to have that water in the fields, and it doesn't ever reach a level where they're going to saturate and waterlog your crops. It's kept at around 60 centimeters deep, so that water, when the water level gets above that, it'll flow over and out into the drainage network. And this practice is been very nice in a way that has environmental benefits and it has agronomic benefits concurrently. And so we see on average around 3 to 5% improvements in crop yields on average over the times we've used these practices at large scales. And so that may not seem like a lot, but that is actually a decent yield boost that the farmers can glean from employing this practice. And we have never seen reductions in yield by employing the practice in our studies. And furthermore, we see during the growing season that we can reduce a variety of nutrients and some fecal indicator bacteria leaving field systems through tile into the broader environment where there might be human exposure down the road there. So these percentages are great examples of how we can kind of concurrently improve yields and actually deal with environmental problems concurrently, as I mentioned. And we don't ever want to look at a particular practice one-dimensionally. If you are impacting the moisture in a field, retaining the water level in that field, etc., there is potential to increase denitrification in that field. That is, to increase conditions that are going to be promoting greenhouse gas emissions, nitrous oxide, for example. In our studies for the fields that we've assessed, we really didn't see tremendous differences between a freely drained system and a system that was under controlled drainage in the context of N2O gas losses. However, we have seen that there has been increases in denitrification during some conditions under this particular practice, but we also see a greater increase in plant nitrogen in these particular practices, which is an excellent result. So that nutrients are being used by the plant for plant growth, hence the yield boosts. So we also want to use these controlled drainage practices to reduce contaminants, say, resulting from manure applications to fields. Dairy operations, they have liquid, they have lagoon manure that they need to put on fields to get rid of it, as well as fertilize their fields. And so how can we use these particular controlled drainage systems to reduce, say, things that are like pathogens, veterinary antibiotics, antimicrobial resistant genes, etc. And we can see here as an example that when we allow a free drain system, we can see when we apply manures to fields in this manner, we can get inputs into the tile for a variety of these pollutants, whereas that isn't the case for controlled drainage when we're managing it during the application. This is a difficult slide to see, but it's going to make the point here that we've looked at Campylobacter pathogen, a pathogen that was responsible for some of the illnesses and deaths in the Walkerton tragedy. So this is an important pathogen, and it's oftentimes associated with manures applied to land. And we can reduce, again, the pathogens and some tetracycline resistant genes, which are marker genes for antimicrobial resistance at the front end of those applications. So we're not getting that movement in and out into the broader environment. We're keeping things in the field environment as much as possible. So it's just kind of amplifying that message that we can control these kinds of things getting out through prudent drainage management practices. I'm going to talk a little bit about land application of municipal biosolids, and we're well aware that they can provide they can help reduce the need for commercial fertilizers, improve soil fertility, enhance soil structure, and add organic matter to the soil. And at the same time, it's a disposal pathway for the wastewater treatment plants. So we recently conducted a study where we looked at microplastics among a suite of Canadian wastewater treatment plants. We're seeing here that a majority of the microplastics in the biosolids that might be applied to land are fibrous form, and there's an enormous number of these microplastics in these biosolids. And it's really doesn't matter where you are in the country, there can be a tremendous amount of these plastics out there. The health or risk implications of microplastics getting ingested by animals and humans, etc. I think there's the jury's a bit out on that still in terms of the precise impact of microplastics. But this research area is now moving very aggressively towards identifying the implications there. And so I was focusing with this research activity on, okay, let's look at what is actually in the sludge or in the municipal biosolids that could be applied to agricultural lands, bringing those materials to areas that might not otherwise receive them. And in the same idea, we've heard, of course, emerging contaminants such as pharmaceutical and personal care products in biosolids, and them getting into groundwater and surface waters, and the implication of that on health endpoints. And we did quite a bit of research on this in the mid-2000s, and being kind of a topical, popular kind of topic, I thought I would share some results of that research. because we do see antibacterials and common household products. There's drugs that get into the wastewater stream, etc. And what happens to those analytes as they get moving down into the sludge and into the environment? What we first looked at is trying to reduce the capacity for that preferential flow, those earthworm burrows, those tracks, moving liquid biosolids down into depths that could go into tile drains and groundwater. And tile drains, again, as we know, are efficient conduits getting water pollutants from the field into broader surface water environments. So we look at land application approaches, and this is a particular airway approach, which is a kind of a vertical tilling approach, is one that we explored for the purpose of truncating some of these pores, reducing their capacity to move things to the tile drains. And we see here, I've showed you this slide already. Here is a tile water as we're moving, and we applied our biosolids to the soil surface, and you can see the turbidity of the water in the tile increase, and become very, very polluted at a certain point. And these particular samples here had quite a few drugs, triclosan, beta blockers, a variety of drugs in them, as well as metals and whatnot that would be expected from biosolids getting into these waterways. However, we can reduce, and I just showed here the aerated approach, the black symbols, we can reduce the fluxes and loads of those particular drugs relative to surface application approaches and subsequent incorporation. And that's another way of kind of keeping things in the soil environment where they can dissipate over time through natural and environmental factors. So again, trying to identify how we can reduce movement of these particular things, whether it's nutrients or drugs or whatever it is, pathogens into tile drains through tillage approaches or land application approaches. And likewise, for solid cakey or dewatered material, there's a variety of approaches that are used. One, it was a more of experimental approach where you see that these dewatered biosolids or sewage sludge is injected under the soil, and the more conventional way where it's spread on the surface and subsequently incorporated into the soil through a disker or a light tiller. We compare these two approaches. And this graph, you don't have to understand all the nuances of it, but effectively what we saw were really no differences between the two approaches. And actually over time, we found that the injected approach provided slightly higher mass loads than the surface application approach. And that has a lot to do with the size of the aggregate being, or the size of the material being injected into the soil versus the surface spreading approaches where the aggregates are exposed perhaps to more atmospheric dissipating factors, UV, insect, biological activity in the soil, etc. But we see that the loads are still very small, and that's good news. So everyone asks too, do we see an impact on, say, soil fauna? They're feeding on these biosolids in the soil? Are they uptaking these chemicals? In this particular case, triclosan, triclocarban, and a transformation product, triclosan, methyltriclosan. These things are being uptaken by certain earthworm species, primarily ones that feed in and around that shallow layer of soil, and that's to be expected. That's what they do. They break down. Whether these worms are being impacted by toxicologically by these biosolids eating them in that zone, we don't know for sure, but we do identify that they are certainly processed by these by these worms, and particularly the ones, again, in shallow soil versus the ones that are Lumbricus terrestris that go deeper, for example. So overall, when we look at approaches, albeit a slow approach, an experimental approach towards injecting these solid materials in the soil, we see that we can reduce a couple of things. The odor is minimized. Odor is a big deal. Even if you surface spreading and incorporating very quickly, odor is a big deal. So neighbors will like that you do not smell the product being applied. It reduces vector attraction, insects, birds, etc. And we reduce preferential flow through means of having a dewater material injected into an area where there can be a tillage-induced truncation of pores that are going to move things down. So overall, we feel the approach is a viable one, injecting these materials. The rheological properties of the biosolids themselves would have to play into the particular injecting system, but it's viable. But it's slow, and I think from an application perspective, there needs to be a speedier approach towards getting these materials on the land if this is going to be an approach used in the future prolifically. And to put a perspective, again, I put this up. You know, like we hear about the nightmares, what's in our groundwater, what's in our surface water, what's in our well water. And this is looking at, you know, the number of 8-ounce glasses of water per day to exceed a drinking water guideline. And, you know, you're looking at a lot of water that would have to be consumed to kind of achieve these. And so it's not like we're going to be, I mean, we like clean water. We don't want to have antidepressants in them, but it doesn't mean that, you know, all is lost. A lot of the concentrations are very low, and some of the dissipation of these chemicals in the environment occur readily. So it's just a perspective here. I'm closing down here, ending the talk, but I want to emphasize that we do approach these looking at how we apply materials to land from a multivariate approach. We apply it right in a way that's going to be respectful of reducing movement off field. And in our case, we looked at how to restrict flow in landscapes where there is subsurface tile drainage. And now, if you do get some movement off and you can't help it, what can you do? We can maybe treat the water that is released from the fields in tiles through what we're calling bioreactors, and bioreactors that are basically pits of wood chips. And this is how we're using them in this study, full of wood chips and water treatment plant residuals, in the case, basically alum. That's kind of a sludge product from drinking water treatment plants that might otherwise go into landfills, filling pits, and then the resulting drainage that moves through these pits is treated. Wood chips are used for denitrification. Alum can kind of bind up phosphorus, but let's see how they behave with other things such as antibiotics and so on. And we see that when veterinary antibiotics which are intrinsically a part of some manure products that are applied to field, yes, it treats very well, especially the water treatment plant residual amended bioreactors, those antibiotics with a very high removal efficiency. And we see when we add these water treatment plant residuals, we improve our capacity to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus species concurrently from moving off field through tiles. So it's a kind of getting at a treatment, a last treatment before you leave your field, and the water is not released to the broader environment. So that's really, I thought, what I would talk about today. And none of this work is done solely by me, of course. A massive team of really the true experts are here, displayed at the final slide here. This is a listing of some important researchers and technical staff for carrying out this work, which is quite ambitious and substantial over these past decades. So thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, David. Just to give some insight into the order of questioners, I've got Peter Bulkowski, Meg Sears, and Ted Manning that are going to be 1, 2, and 3 in terms of asking the question. Before that, I'm going to ask a couple of questions myself. One is very brief. At the beginning of the presentation, I thought I saw a statement about there was a role of robins in mosquito populations. And sort of, we've had an excessive number of robins on our property this year, and also an excessive number of mosquitoes. So probably a very short response to that. But then going back to sort of your concluding remarks about the application of by-wastes onto fields, back a few years ago, there was a proposal to dump septic tank waste, untreated septic tank waste, on fields close to residential properties. And there was a great rebellion from the residents about the health impacts to them as a result of this practice. Could you tell me whether that practice has is still an issue, or whether the removal of septic tank waste, and sort of all of us that are out in a rural area have septic tank waste that has to be disposed of? Is there a preferential way of disposing of it? So robins and septic tank waste.
Yeah, well, the robins study, the recent study that part of this kind of environmental change, One Health Observatory activity, robins and rabbits are blood meal for mosquitoes, so they can serve as it's indicating a bit some of the I want to say the disease cycling ecology of mosquitoes that have a vector-borne risk, for example, West Nile, or so on. So that's really the getting at. We see robins in semi-urban areas, etc. And in more in areas where there's more natural landscapes, we see a different kind of ecology there. And so it's robins can bring in things, and so rabbits are implicated in the movement from mosquitoes prefer or have access to these particular animals. So it's shedding a little light on really the disposition of the birds and what the blood meal is within a landscape setting. And regarding the septic question, I wouldn't be able to comment on that from a regulatory perspective, but it doesn't seem to be. It seems that these things are. They get pumped and they're taken to different places, and I don't know what the local jurisdictional regulations would be regarding that, and if it's legal or not. But certainly they would be, neighbors would be concerned having that significant amount of that being put on the fields.
Okay, well, thank you. So Peter, your question, and Meg Sears, you're on deck.
David, lots of interesting ideas and approaches to shifting agriculture. The prairie saw a lot of windbreaks installed after the 1930s, and my perception when I drive around is that most of those windbreaks are gone or deteriorated. So getting and keeping these changes in place is not that simple. Getting the farmers committed to it, the way I phrased the question was, if we start to apply some of these more complex solutions and land uses and so on, does the number of man hours spent by the farmer per unit of crop produced, does his labor increase or decrease or stay the same?
Mhm.
There's a land cost as well, but in terms to get the farmers involved or committed, if their workload is going to increase significantly for the same amount of crop, you're going to have a hard sell.
Yes, I mean, that is, for example, if I can speak about control tile drainage, requires actual manual adjustment of these particular flow gates for purposes of managing that drainage. And that requires time. And I think that probably the biggest impediment for this particular practice being used prolifically, despite its yield benefits, it's the labor. And I mean, anybody who's does agriculture or has done research in agriculture will tell you that the farmers are tapped out. It's busy, and adding a workload or another element that is going to give you, say, 3 to 5% improvements in yield on average isn't worth it. To some, it isn't. To others, it might be in the context of, say, some of the environmental endpoints of that result from it as well. So you're absolutely right. I think that always will be an issue. And we try to look at some of these like land application approaches that are one pass approaches, reducing fuel use and reducing compaction effects, etc. So those are time savers and fuel savers for sure. But it's not always the case for some of these practices.
Thank you for your answers.
Okay, Meg. And Ted Manning is on deck.
After listening to more and listening to your last response, I have about 3 more questions, but I'll stick with the one I've got in the chat right now. I was interested in the whole notion of these vector-borne diseases and so on. I looked at it a bit back when West Nile virus landed in New York City, and they were talking about spraying all sorts of pesticides to kill mosquitoes. And after time researching West Nile virus in particular, and also looking, kind of living through it now, because West Nile virus has been with us for quite a while, it seemed that there was, West Nile virus is really more a bird disease than a human disease. And the amount of West Nile virus in the environment is really the viral load in birds. And so it's having a high viral load in birds, and then the mosquitoes can transmit it to people. But that was kind of the risk, is how sick are the birds? And so I was wondering, there are things that affect human immunity and also bird immunity. And so how is that being kind of treated these days? There's this, actually, there's the example of West Nile virus in birds. And it recently came to my attention that the grasshoppers in Western Canada, which are decimating crops in Saskatchewan and so on, turns out that there is a microbe in the soil that is a pathogen for grasshoppers that Canada has researched. And this microbe is killed by glyphosate. So while organic farmers are being blamed for not putting on enough insecticides, really these most of the farmers are killing off the natural control. So there's this kind of balance of, in the environment, we have natural parts that if we mess with it, we can easily make it worse. So I was wondering if you have researched that and kind of what the state of knowledge is from your point of view on this kind of issue.
Yeah, I wouldn't. Well, certainly I'm aware that you mess with something, you have domino effects, you have unforeseen effects, and it's certainly that is something that is kind of at the heart of the talk here. Is that you might a particular practice may be beneficial for, say, biodiversity, but it may have be a problem for, I don't know, carbon sequestration water quality. There is a trade-off, and we try to find kind of a non-zero sum kind of approach that it's going to optimize. And yeah, right, you wipe out a particular microbe, and it could have a lingering effect down the line. We aren't looking particularly at that kind of the glyphosate grasshopper thing in our research, but that flavor of looking at kind of domino implications is very important in the context of, let's say, natural capital in an environment. And I think you saw that one example might be that if you're looking at trees, and you're reducing insulation into a particular area, you might have, you may not have the capacity to say, take up nitrogen, and then you get maybe greater fluxes of N2O in those areas versus others, that kind of thing. The West Nile virus and the disease movement, emerging viruses, is very, very important. Obviously, everyone's sensitive to the idea of viruses socially and whatnot. And so the work that we're doing is really about looking at climate, weather, and land use drivers for mosquitoes that are going to be important vectors for those diseases. And we're looking at the diseases in particular, birds and particular animals. And West Nile is important. Eastern equine encephalitis. There's California cerebar, etc., that are going to be kind of things are moving a little north with favorable climates. So those are the kinds of things we're looking at in particular in this particular work, and the regulatory, kind of the disease regulation angles of natural capital. Again, showing that some habitats might be promoting mosquito species that are more prone to disease than others.
That's fascinating. When West Nile virus first came to Ontario, there was a map put out by Public Health Ontario showing where there were the hotspots of human infection. And by far and away, the worst hotspot in Ontario was the richest part of Oakville, which was heavily sprayed by pesticides. Every lawn and so on, they were very high usage of pesticides. So, sometimes we're kind of our own worst enemy, but the effects on immunity and those kind of they're not overt, but they're there, effects on animal health, bird health, and so on. I think that we're perhaps under recognizing them. So I'll be really interested to follow your work and see if you're able to pick up on some of these more subtle effects that actually, not well detected effects, but they're incredibly important. We just don't recognize them.
Public Health Agency Canada, they're always, they're dealing with public health. It's their mandate, obviously. Compromised populations, immunocompromised, these are going to be, those sensitivities are being looked at. And of course, that's kind of beyond our particular role in our department. But in working with them, we're providing what we can on the ag side, or at least the landscape side of things, to try to understand, how at least these things might be moving or migrating with climate change, for example. Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you, Meg. Yeah, and Ted, you're next. I just want to ask Claude Butner. You put a comment in the chat box. Do you want to say something about it, or if not, then Raymond Desjardins will follow Ted Manning. So at this point, Ted Manning.
Oh, Ray's on. It's good. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you resonate very well, David. I come from largely the same background. I grew up on an orchard, and every time they overwatered, my basement was full. And every time they wanted to do integrated pest management, they told us to stay inside. And then I ended up being the head of land use planning and research for Environment Canada for several years. We had a real struggle in getting people to understand that environments, whether they were farm or forest or wetland, were not just single purpose things. And we had a real struggle to get people to understand that they were managing not just for producing whatever it was they were being paid for, but an awful lot of large environmental functions. And you have really got really good data on some of these relationships that I think are very important. But I think we're coming back to the same struggle we had, which was how do we get people to understand that it's worth managing for more than just the product or crop that they are doing, and how do we get them rewarded for doing so?
Yeah, that's the magic question. I mean, there's pay for services. We hear Alice, the program is one example where they're going to pay for ecosystem services or having natural features on landscapes, etc. Things may be going that way in the context of, and again, Ray's on here. He'd be able to comment on that more than I could regarding, say, carbon offsets and credits and so on, paying for some of these things on farms. And of course, there's a big debate about that. Is it the role of the government? Is it the role of the farmers to do it? Is it the role of industry? And I mean, that's a slippery slope. But I do believe that if we are going to be meeting targets, we may have to invest. That's my personal view on it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good.
Okay, so Claude?
Yes, my comment actually was feeding on what Ted had said in the chat. It wasn't really a question, but I will turn it into one. But I'll tell you that decades ago, I was traveling the countryside to my brother-in-law, who was a farmer until he died, actually. I remember seeing a stand of trees where the house had disappeared years ago, but there were still stands of trees where you could tell that the old farmsteads were. And I said, what a shame to get rid of that. And they're not even using the wood. They're putting it in a pile and burying some of it and burning the rest of it. And he said, yeah, the thinking is that it's wasted land. So, it's that old problem with looking at the biosphere as wasted land that is not producing something that can be measured. And so it isn't ignorance, because they know that periodically the government, either the county or the state or the federal, gives incentives, sometimes even give trees or give discounted trees, and people put up windbreaks. And it always seems to be the windbreak is there as long as the program exists. And then as soon, it doesn't educate the farmer to keep this windbreak because that's part of good farming. Rather, it's, well, that program expired. Now I want the land back. And so my question really is, this feels like part of the decades, maybe centuries long trend to go to larger and larger corporate farms. And so the people who actually do the work right now are still owners here in the United States, at least, but I know in England that happened a long time ago, where all the landowners are in London or other areas of wealth, and the people who actually do the land are tenants. And so is this a normal, are we sort of doomed unless we build in these requirements? Like, okay, if it's going to be a business, if we're going to have corporate agriculture, these are the game rules. Every quarter of a mile, you will have a break. And that's built into your taxes. And end of discussion. So do you want to improvise around that question? Is that a solution, or is that just?
Well, I like that. I mean, especially for the mega farms, right? They got the capital, they got the economies of scale, and they can probably handle that. I mean, we see up north in this Ontario, the clay belt. I mean, there's, as you're moving, the heat units and whatnot are getting growing degree days or are improving for the purposes of crop growth. And so, but the owners of the land are buying this land up, and they are, but the owners are in, say, Southern Ontario or elsewhere. And so is there a desire on their part to be kind of local stewards, respecting kind of almost an aesthetic or water quality issues at that place if they're living elsewhere? I don't know. But I do feel that if you have an economy of scale for some of these farmers and farms, that you could have something built in, and it might actually be a betterment for them in the context of some of their productivity, and not just. But I mean, it's a tough one to know for sure how to go with that, and it's certainly not my area of expertise, but it's an option.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Claude. And Raymond, you'll be next, but I also would like to give Rick Monroe an opportunity to make his comment. And Rick, if you can do that after Raymond Desjardins, and then after that, it will be Meg again.
Thank you very much. Hi, Dave.
Okay.
I was surprised that you did not mention the publication by Agriculture Canada on nature-based solution to reduce greenhouse gas emission, which I was co-author, but what I find is we didn't do a very good job in some ways. We have not included a lot of things that I think should have been included. For example, the CO2 equivalents due to change in net radiation. Like, for example, the boreal forest. We always think planting trees is a very good idea. Like we plan to plant 3 billion trees, but the net radiation, like we've published some paper many years ago on the net radiation between a boreal forest and a grassland is 14 watt per meter square on annual basis difference. And that's equivalent to 7 degrees C. So, there are a lot of places where we could have done a better job in these nature-based solutions. And that's what I was sort of wanted to mention, because they were very promising, because they're promising by 2030 to reduce more than the actual greenhouse gas emission with these nature-based solutions. So these are worth mentioning. So
yes, no, you're right, Ray. I've I know that work, and I didn't, of course, there's lots of things I didn't include in here, but that you're absolutely right, and maybe you could provide the link to that article. I don't know if it's possible to do it in the chat.
okay, I will.
Yeah, no, it's great to see you. I didn't know you were on. Ray Desjardins works in the same center as I have, and he's the greenhouse gas guy. He should be talking about that.
Yeah, I might give a talk apparently around January 13 on
Good, perfect.
the evolution of agricultural meteorology research, and will allow me to cover a lot of those topics. Nice.
Perfect.
Thank you, Dave.
Okay, so thank you, Ray, and Rick Monroe, and then Meg Sears.
Yeah, thanks. Mine is a rather political question, so if you don't want to answer it, that's I would understand. It concerns the lack of capacity within Ag Canada. I think back to 40 years ago, 50 years ago, when Canada still had, or Ag Canada still had a strong plant breeding program. It was dissolved pretty much. I mean, there are remnants of it, but nothing like what it used to be. The industry, the sector has been pretty much handed over to the agrochemical companies, just the way Pat Mooney and other people warned it would. The other thing I think of is the PFRA out west and the excellent work that they did for almost 80 years on shelter belts. We just heard about leveling the trees in the farmsteads and so on. And again, I mean, to me, Ag Canada, it's reflected in the roundtables. They listen to industry predominantly, and that influences the direction of, I presume, research and certainly policy. The focus certainly seems to be on production pretty much at all costs. And so, to get to my question, how will, if climate change is caused by emissions, and emissions are tied pretty much directly to agricultural inputs, at least as in the ag sector, how can we farmers help that if the dominant influences are from the corporate sector that are in the business of selling the inputs that we need to reduce in order to reduce emissions to help climate change? So that's kind of a weird question, but.
Well, no, I think I understand what you mean. And the science and technology branch, and again, I would ask Ray if he's been a part of the conversation for developing. I think Ray, you were part of developing some of these missions. There's like 4 kind of from the science and technology branch side. There's kind of resilient landscapes, dealing with kind of resilient agriculture. Climate change is a part of that. The circular economy, kind of getting that, closing that loop. And the other one is kind of more digital transformations in the context of how we do business, from whether it's genomics or predictive analytics or AI or whatever. And those are kind of pillar missions that have been put forth kind of by the powers that be. And I do believe that, you know, through the clusters, and they're much more kind of commodity based, industry focused. There's kind of these areas within the branch that are for kind of public good work. And I think these missions reflect that to some degree. You know, of course, it would be nice to have, like you mentioned, PFRA, enormously successful component of the department. And I had work that involved PFRA back in the 2000s there, and it's extended through the branch development through ESB and whatnot. And a lot of those initiatives have kind of are still ongoing. Some of they've stopped, but they're kind of new approaches. So it's tough to know, because there's been a lot of repackaging of some of the activities. The breeding programs, again, I wouldn't be able to really comment on that, but you know, I don't know, Ray, if you know anything about what's been going on with the breeding programs. I think they've been kind of winnowed down a bit over the course of the past few decades, but I think there's a real need for breeding within the department. We're doing things there that industry and academia may not be able to do. And so anyway, it's not really a great answer for you, but it's my comment. Yeah.
So
Thank you.
Meg, before you begin, Ray Desjardins, do you have a comment? David thought you might.
Or reading program as far as livestock is like, they're so much more productive. You need much less dairy cows to produce the same amount of milk. There's things like this, and there's need for better cover crops too. And breeding program, they're working on that a little bit too. So that's about all I can say. Thank you very much.
Okay. Meg, and then John Legg, you'll be after Meg.
Yes, thanks so much. I wanted to follow up a bit on the contrast between conventional, whatever that is, and organic agriculture, because I was involved with the Saskatchewan organic meeting a couple weeks ago, and so it's, you know, it's all anecdotal, but they're having a really, really rough go. All the field trials were completely trashed, the organic field trials at Agriculture Canada. You know, first of all, there was the drought, and then there were the grasshoppers, and then they had a huge amount of hail that, you know, smashed down any remnant plants. So that area of the country is really, really suffering. But before the hail, farmers who were in the audience and participating were saying that, you know, their organic farms actually did have patches of, you know, harvestable crops that you know, whereas their conventional neighbors were completely dried up and gone. So and there were a lot of farmers saying this kind of thing, and I've heard it from elsewhere. And anecdotally, there's an awful lot of people saying that we really do have to be shifting to some of these practices that are really just you know, keeping the cover crops on the ground, which they're doing a lot better job of in Western Canada than they are in Eastern, but also really not putting toxic chemicals on the ground, pesticides continue to increase in Canada. The numbers of pesticides, there are some very persistent chemicals that actually break down into compounds that destroy the ozone layer. But that was a new one for me. So I'm wondering what can be done to improve this shift to really take up some of the more natural solutions, which we're seeing are, preserving the soil, preserving the microbes, keeping soil cooler, and on the ground, on the face of it, in the face of some really nasty conditions, at least there's some crops as opposed to nothing whatsoever. So I've been involved with the agriculture, or been looking at the sustainable agriculture initiatives, the partnerships that never ever mention organic methods. There seems to be a total blockade, and at the same time as Canada is committed to reducing pesticides, we are increasing the numbers and the volumes and the usage and the sales. So from your point of view, within, probably trapped, I don't know, within, your masters, where are we going? Because from my point of view outside, looking at consultations and meetings and so on, it's looking as if we're kind of going down the wrong path.
Yeah, I don't know. To be honest with you, I'm not. I don't. Haven't done a lot of organic work on organic farming on farm, but I will say that one of the things that we're trying to do and look at, kind of lower the inputs, is again through natural capital. Again, what can say healthy riparian zones, fence lines, hedgerows do for agriculture? Biocontrol, for example. And I mean, the biocontrol, parasitoid wasps that are going to be, dealing with particular pests, etc. These are little things, incremental things we could look at. I mean, there's also broader, outside of agriculture too. I mean, the forest industry. I mean, do we need to be spraying glyphosate in some of the, to deal with understory control? In some of the forested areas? I know some provinces restrict it, and some others don't. That's another avenue in. So I don't know where big agriculture will go with this, but we're looking from our side of things. We're thriving kind of natural features in these agro ecosystems and their services that they can provide as a means to reduce, say, pressures on biodiversity and whatnot. So that's the off-field kind of perspective.
That's fascinating that you mentioned the forests and the glyphosate, because we've had record forest fires this year, and some people are saying that the use of glyphosate in development of the forest to eliminate all of what are known to be fire breaks, the birches and the aspens and so on, and growing monoculture conifers is like setting up a tinderbox. And so we're seeing problems that way. And so I don't know if you're actually looking at the connection between glyphosate and forest fires, which of course is a long period, but the glyphosate is used for a particular pattern of growth. And is that pattern of growth missing out on kind of its fire suppressant characteristics? And is it producing something that's a lot more flammable?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So you're not looking at that right now, or is that? No.
We've looked at pesticide
I didn't think you were.
Yeah, we looked at pesticide residues in country foods
Okay.
that in Indigenous communities we were collecting and so on and so some of that is related to some of the pesticide used from the forest perspective.
Right.
And some provinces are restrict that, others don't, and but that's the extent of it. But I haven't drawn any link to forest fire risk. I mean, some of the talk I gave here, I'm looking at a kind of hydroclimate modeling that'll give you some sense of, and the Canadian Forest Service is involved in the project as well. Risk of forest fires,
Right.
Just more physical basis, that means, but nothing linked to pesticides at this stage. No, but that would be interesting. Someone probably will jump on that.
Oh, I hope they do. Thanks so much.
Okay, John, if you could just hang on a minute. Richard Vanderzag would like to have a brief comment, and then you'll be the final presenter.
Oh, thanks, Phil. David, it was an interesting presentation. Actually, Meg's questions are a perfect segue into the two questions I have. So one is just the overall environmental footprint of organic versus non-organic farming, which is a pretty big question. And then the second question, which follows on that, really is how can we avoid having these persistent chemicals, drugs that are being spread on the crops? Avoid that from happening in the first place, because that's really important, because these are not non-toxic, right? They're, in fact, let me to rephrase that, these are toxic, and you have enough of it and you get exposed to enough of it, it can actually affect human health.
Right. No, I mean, absolutely. And I think there's, I mean, for, let's say, biosolids, for example, I mean, there are regulations out there, jurisdictional constraints for how to put these things on, when to put them on. Is it a food product, an edible product for humans? Is it livestock cropping systems that you're putting these things on, etc. And also regulations on how to apply these materials. Again, the organic versus inorganic farming context, it's not something that I would have a great deal of expertise in outside, again, of that we want to look at every conceivable capacity of natural features in these agro-ecosystems. And I mean, for their capacity to help agriculture, but also then promote biodiversity and deal with some other issues like carbon, for example.
It would be nice to build up a stronger case for organic farming. Well,
I'm hoping that the organic cluster, there's some interesting projects that are coming out of that they might, I think, start snowballing a bit more on that, especially with some of the COP, the recent COP and targets that were set out. And I know that the pesticide component of that is something that our department is looking into, and we'll probably focus some research on looking at alternative approaches or whatnot associated with pesticide use. So we'll see what happens. But the natural capital component in there, it should not be parsed off. It's part of the equation. And these are the features that actually are important for biocontrol, insects, for example, and for high value crops that could be actually very economically valued.
Be prepared to fight crop life with all its deep pockets. They were a very big presence at the last COP.
Okay, thank you, Richard. And John, your turn.
Thank you, Phil. You have a wide area of influence, David. Thank you for your comments. I appreciate your speculation on the second short, sharp question here. First one is simply to follow up on some questions already. Ted Manning was the first one, I think. In these days of constant budgetary overspending, is there an increased use of financial incentives to take more seriously environmentally wise measures? And if not, why not? Your speculation would be appreciated.
So you're basically, I mean, under these you're under the fiscal constraints that we're all kind of in here. You're asking about putting more money towards incentives for farmers to adopt practices that are more environmentally sound practices.
Yes, generally, but any other areas where you might provide such incentives? I mean, land use, for example. I mean, this is a broad area, and it's even beyond my own knowledge, but you certainly have a better idea than I do as to the areas where you could use incentives for people who have an effect to do something, because we've made a big mess out of a lot, and I'm now referring to the future of our planet in a very broad way. So anyone who can lean on people, but much more powerfully to incentivize people.
Yeah, like provincially, like the environmental farm plans and so on, basically open doors for farmers to get grants to put on, say, environmentally friendly BMPs and so on. And a lot of these programs, and I wouldn't be able to comment on the state of that initiative right now. I haven't looked at it, but whether it's dissolved or not. But there's a whole bath of kind of open a closet where you could get grants for certain things if you provide an environmental farm plan, and that's something of value for the farmer intrinsically. How those particular incentives are manifested provincially or even under different jurisdictions. I mean, I know, like, for example, the South Nation Conservation Authority provide grants for farmers to, or anybody really, to conduct kind of environmentally friendly activities, and they have a list of particular practices that are granted, and you fill it out and it gets reviewed and so on. And controlled drainage was one of them at one point. So I think there's at a local jurisdictions there are these granting programs, and then as you tier up, and as programs branch and our department is delivering funds to these particular focal points for doing that, I don't know proportionally how that looks from, say, 10 years ago to now. But I mean, there would probably be somebody in our programs branch that could answer that from the environmental incentive side, if you're thinking about granting and tax breaks and things like that.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. It's about time to wrap things up. And Jean Doherty, I see you're ready to do the thank you. Away you go.
Thank you, Phil. And David, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation that you gave today. As a former government scientist, I'm delighted to see that there's actually funding for some research rather than just being a granting agency for other people to do the work. And I just think it was wonderful to hear you talking about agriculture. We haven't had very many discussions or talks on this particular topic at the kind of level you were discussing it. So thank you very much for that.
No, you're welcome. No, I agree with you. That's your perspective on that. It's I am a big supporter of government research, and so that I think writ large, there's a niche, and I know government research in the grand scheme of things has winnowed down a bit in relation to the academic and industry contributions to that to the work there. But I hope we keep it up there. Sure, Ray would comment on that positively as well too. So it's benefited.
Absolutely, absolutely. And for those of you who are still with us, I'd like to say thank you very much for attending this week's presentation. Again, another wonderful presentation that's been put on by the organizing committee for our Zoom sessions. If you are interested in seeing this particular talk or any of the other Zoom talks that we've had, I'd encourage you to go to our canadiancore.com website, sign up for the Stay Informed section, And there you will get the link to this particular talk and a way to find other material that we've had in our previous talks as well. If you're interested in finding out more about our association, please check that part, as well as if you're interested in becoming a member. It's not a whole lot of money to be a member, and I would strongly encourage you to come out and sign up to be a member for KCOR. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for coming out, and stay tuned for things in a few weeks, I think. Thank you.